everyone. That's if you're in Europe, good morning. Also, good evening to those who it's a bit later in the day in your time zone. Welcome to this webinar that we are holding today, Third World Network. The webinar, as we mentioned in the invite, is about examining the positions that are taken by the European Union and other developed countries in the pathogen access and benefit sharing negotiations that are ongoing, and whether the positions that are being taken are actually about promoting innovation, protecting intellectual property monopolies, or are they really also about undermining right to science and equity? Right, so we're going to be looking at some of the key issues that are actually being considered in the PABS negotiations that are quite contentious and controversial. Now, just as we move forward, I think the PABS negotiations are being taken in the context of the pandemic agreement. So we must ask ourselves, what is the objective of the pandemic agreement? So if I recall, the pandemic agreement is to be guided by equity. Equity is the core component, the center of the pandemic agreement, the principles of the pandemic agreement, and with that to prevent, prepare for, and respond to pandemics. So coincidentally, as we sent out invitation for this webinar, the next day there was a notice that was also sent by WHO Secretariat that a briefing will be held on this topic, PABS. And it's going on right now at the executive board of the World Health Organization in Geneva, right about now. Whether it's coincidence, planned, we don't know. But what is clear, it's a hot topic for discussion for sure. Next week, the Intergovernmental Working Group 5 will be meeting in Geneva to continue negotiations. As you may recall, there was the 4th Intergovernmental Working Group that met in December, early December, and it had a resume session in January, just as many of us were just coming out of our New Year holidays. And we are going to have about a week-long meeting, negotiations again, beginning next week. So let me introduce myself. I'm Sangeeta Shashikant from Third World Network, and I will be multitasking today. I'm moderating, but I also am kicking off the discussions with the first presentation. The second I'll be speaking more about contracts, and I'll explain later why. Second presentation will be by my colleague from Third World Network, Nitin Ramakrishnan, who is a senior researcher at Third World Network. He'll be addressing another very central issue, which is sequence information. We have with us 3 discussants. I'm not going to read their very, very long CVs, but they are very well known for their extensive work in public health, their experience in this area. And they have, from the very beginning, called for equity during the COVID pandemic, but also during the pandemic treaty negotiations and now the PABS negotiations. So just in terms of, before we start, to say that if you have any questions, we will have 2 presentations, and then we will have the discussants comment. And as time permits, we will take questions. But if you have any questions, to the panelists, you can put in the chat. That will be the best way. Then it can be picked up as as the presentations and the discussions continue. So with that, I'll just look at the time. We will begin with the first presentation, which is mine. So I'll be speaking about PABS and contracts. Okay, so let me just... So you may ask, why do we speak about contracts, right? So contracts are the main tool by which we see the PABS is its important core component by which the PABS system is to be operationalized. And I will just go through some basic background information for those that maybe are not aware as to why I'm saying this. So if we go with... If we go by the CBD Convention, Article 15, Article 15 talks about the sovereign rights of states over the biological resources. It talks about access to genetic resources rests with national government. Access shall be on mutually agreed terms. So we'll talk about mutually agreed terms. And it also talks about benefits arising from the commercial and other utilization of genetic resources. And these are also to be agreed on mutually agreed terms between the provider and the recipient of any such resources. And the CBD was the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in this context, perhaps we are talking about biological resources. We are talking about the sharing of pathogen material and sequence information. So it is the subject matter of CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. So CBD is the mother convention, so to speak, and Nagoya Protocol was the specific protocol on access and benefit sharing. And Article 6G of Nagoya Protocol says there should be clear rules and procedures for mutually agreed terms. And this should be set out in writing. And when we talk of mutually agreed terms, it talks about dispute settlement clause, terms on benefit sharing, including addressing intellectual property rights, terms of subsequent third-party use, and I'll go and come to that later, and then changes of intent, for instance, from commercial, non-commercial to commercials, right, where this is applicable. So you can already see that when we look at the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, it is really taking a contractual approach. And the EU regulation on Nagoya Protocol as well speaks about it. It talks about mutually agreed terms, means contractual agreements, specific provisions on benefit sharing, further terms and conditions with respect to utilization and subsequent applications and commercialization. So they are already, the EU already foresees, has set out that, when we look at implementing ABS, it has to be based on contractual arrangements, all right? Now, when we look at Article 12 of the Pandemic Agreement, which is the legal basis for the PABS Annex, right? And the PABS is really about operationalizing ABS at the multilateral level, right? ABS is normally done nationally, state to state, provider recipient, but now we are looking at operationalizing ABS at the multilateral level, and this is why the whole negotiations of PABS began. Right? And Article 12 of the Pandemic Agreement, which is the guiding framework, is very clear that, the provisions of the PABS instrument, the modalities, terms, and conditions on access and benefit sharing must be so that they provide legal certainty, all right? The legal certainty. Now, how do we achieve legal certainty? Is via contracts, right? Not by terms of reference, not by just setting it out on a piece of paper, certain provisions, right? It's through contracts. And we have seen that in December, there were joint proposals for standard contracts that came from 80 developing countries. There were 3 contracts that were proposed, right? One is within the WHO Coordinating Laboratory Network, sharing with the WHO Coordinating Laboratory Network. One is outside of the network with other entities that are not part of the network, and one is with respect to the sharing of sequence informations where data access agreement was proposed. Okay, so 3 contracts have been proposed. Now, you may not be aware, actually in December, when the report was adopted, the Bureau was supposed to come up with some text. We didn't see any text as civil society that have been engaged in this process, but during the January meeting, the Bureau had proposed certain text. This text was not made publicly available. We could not comment on the text that was actually proposed, and I think to date that text is also not available. What you have available is the text after certain additions were made by member states during the discussions in January. But if you see this text, you will see that they are proposing operational elements. Do you see any difference? The difference is this. It says here for WHO, a coordinated laboratory network, they speak about terms and conditions. For WHO recognized sequence database, it talks about terms and conditions. It does not even mention about the users, but it just says the WHO recognized sequence database will operate under terms and conditions. When it comes to entities using PABS materials and sequence information for commercial purposes, it talks about contracts. And then when we talk about non-commercial purposes, entities using it for non-commercial purposes, it speaks about terms and conditions, right? So when we have text that talks about terms and conditions differently from WHO PABS contracts. And I understand that during the meeting, there were suggestions, maybe by WHO Secretariat, that terms and conditions are similar to, like they are agreed, they're similar to contracts. I don't know, we are not in the negotiations. But clearly, just looking at the text, there is a distinction between terms and conditions and WHO PABS contracts. Now, the whole idea of the PABS system, and you see that in paragraph 4, the suggestion is that, parties have to review their national law and align it with the annex. But if the annex is not consistent with the basic fundamental principles of access and benefit sharing system, it creates a problem because we are now actually undermining international rights that countries have under international conventions on that are relevant to access and benefit sharing. So we have an issue here that the vision is that parties would somehow align with the annex, but the annex itself, the way it is crafted or proposed, it is not really aligned with what are the requirements of CBD and the Nagoya Protocol in terms and the concept of contractual arrangements that we need to see to operationalize ABS. So I just want to flag this. Okay, so I want to talk about the Bureau's proposed text for the resume session, which was presented in January. It talks about PABS contracts, as I mentioned just now. It talks about previous, yeah? Sorry. Yeah. It talks about PABS contracts for commercial purposes. That's the participating manufacturers and other entities for commercial purposes. But it's in a section called C, which is really about benefit sharing. There is no clarity when the contract will be signed. So the EU's position has always been that the contract, that there should be the benefit sharing and access should be delinked. And the participating manufacturers can decide to sign contracts, but they can also decide not to sign contracts. So the kind of language that is proposed kind of fits very well with what the European Union would like to see. The problem with the system is that it enabling free riders into the system because there's no clarity when the contract will be signed. And so over time, you can see that we are creating a system that will be undermined and that will be ineffective in delivering what it's supposed to deliver. There is no clarity on other terms and conditions. It's not even clear whether there'll be other terms and conditions. There's no standardization. It seems as if, WHO is going to be negotiating bilateral contracts with various different terms and conditions, which kind of makes a mockery of what we are trying to create, because the whole idea of a multilateral PABS system was to have standardized contracts, standardized terms and conditions. So the provider knows what they are giving and on what terms they are giving, and the recipient also has legal certainty. There are also many other gaps. It does not address onward transfer. So for instance, if an entity were to take this material, and if they were just allowed to transfer to any other entity, that other entity is going to be free riding on the system. So it becomes a system that is very extractive and, overall, it would be an undermining of the PABS system. It does not talk about intellectual property. It does not talk about dispute settlement resolution. These are all elements for an effective PABS contract. Now, when we talk about other entities within the system, laboratories within WHO coordinating laboratory network, recognized sequence databases, non-commercial users, they use the word terms and conditions, as I've shown you, but these per se are not contracts. Neither are they enforceable. There is no standardization. Again, the problem about gaps. So you can imagine academic institutions where they only play the role of getting materials and sharing it outside the system, but because they have no other commitments to the system, right? They're not even contractually bound to the system. So this is a big challenge. We are creating a very unbalanced system. And which is mostly extractive. Now, there were some insertions that I understand some were made by certain developing countries. These are all in brackets. They added the word legally binding. But these words per se do not address the gaps that need to be, that remain in the system. It's not even clear whether it will be enforceable, whether there'll be dispute resolution, and what about the other terms and conditions. So the point I would like to make here is that from from our examination of the text, the proposals of developing countries have been ignored, and a large number of developing countries have made these proposals. And it seems to be accommodating more the European Union and what it would like to see. Now, the question is, this is really undermining fair implementation of the international ABS rules. And if we are to create a non-transparent, unaccountable, extractive PABS system, can such a system really deliver for health emergencies, right? It's just going to create a lot of frustration. It's going to demotivate sharing. In the end, it's going to be quite unworkable. So I just want to very quickly show you that these standard contracts that we speak about are the norm when we talk about sharing of biological material and also related information and data. They are the norm in the South. They're especially the norm in the North, in Europe especially. I've given you here material transfer agreement from the European Molecular Biology Lab. The Norwegians, the universities use it. The Swiss universities use it. The European Research Infrastructure for Biobanking uses it. And they are very clear that material transfer agreements, data transfer agreements, data access agreements should always be used to govern material transfer between parties. Okay. We also have 15 years of experience in WHO with standard material transfer agreements, which were negotiated by the very countries that are right now opposed to it. Standard Material Transfer 1, Standard Material Transfer 2. Following its negotiations, 15 SMTA tools has been signed with manufacturers, 73 have been signed with research and academic institutions, and 2 have been signed with other product manufacturers. So that WHO has a lot of experience in this area. A lot of the arguments that were put forward, that are being put forward in these negotiations were actually debated 15 years ago during the negotiations of the PIP framework. And, we see rather than building on this experience, creating a better system, we are facing opposition, objections to go below this system, to create a worse system, right? So PIP framework sets some standard. We should be building on that experience, addressing what works, taking what works, addressing what did not work. But on the contrary, because of the frivolous opposition we see in the PABS negotiations, we see that what is being created is even less than what we have in the PIP framework. So does that generate legal certainty as Article 12 requires? Definitely not. There is also the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Now, this system, we have seen them sign 100,000 over standard material transfer agreements, and these are also largely by public research institutions. So for the Bureau's text to say non-commercial users should not, there's no mention of contracts, standard material transfer agreements, but you see that the experience out there is very much different. They even have something called Easy SMTA. So the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources has its own challenges, okay? But you can see that it has a system, and they have got SMTAs that have been signed, including by non-commercial users. And they have this Easy SMTA homepage where you can actually generate SMTAs in 6 different official languages as required. I think in this digital age, to actually say that all of this is not possible is kind of ridiculous. So these are some of the common provisions that you would see in material transfer agreement and standard material transfer agreement. So you would have normally the parties to the agreement. If you look at the PIP framework, it's mentioned in SMTA 1, in Annex 1, in Annex 2. The parties to the agreement, you see the Bureau's text, there's no proposal. Normally there is the subject matter of the agreement. Here there is no proposal. Very interestingly, you'll see in all MTAs, they're very specific in terms of the use for which the material can be utilized. And actually, all these MTAs, material transfer agreements that we are looking at, only permit strictly for non-commercial purpose, and they're very strict. It's even much narrower than the text of non-commercial purpose. The Bureau's text says public health purpose. Okay, this is language in Article 12, but it is very broad. What kind of public health purpose, right? Are we going to go beyond the objective of the pandemic agreement? Now, if you look at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory Material Transfer Agreement, they are very, very specific. Material shall be used exclusively for the purpose described. And they even say after conclusion of the studies, the material shall be promptly destroyed or returned to AMBL, right? They even say material shall be erased from the computer, right? The recipient can also shall also inform on request the status of its research. So there are very specific provisions in this material transfer agreement. Even on onward transfer, yeah, you'll see that the PIP framework, that means to say a recipient receives the material, the question is, can they do onward transfer to another third party? Now, the PIP framework says you can transfer the PIP biological material if the prospective recipient has also concluded an SMTA with WHO. We don't see this kind of text in the Bureau. The Oslo University MTA says the material may not be transferred without prior written authorization from the supplier. The AMBL MTA says it must not be released to any person. So you can see that the material transfer agreement provisions in Europe, and if you see a lot of others, whether it is in the US as well, you'll find that there are very strict provisions about onward transfer. But we don't see this kind of language in the Bureau's text. Although subsequently, after the insertions of member states, we see some language saying that this will be addressed, but we have yet to see really concrete language. There is also often provisions on publications, acknowledgement, handling, on transport of material. Now, I think handling and transport of material, so publications and acknowledgement, you do see text. For instance, you do see on acknowledgement and recognition, of course, this text can always be improved. Handling of materials, there is not much clarity. We are actually transporting dangerous pathogen materials. So it is very odd for actually there to be no mention about the obligations of recipients in terms of handling of this material. On intellectual property, there is a very inadequate proposal. Now, when it comes to the WHO coordinating laboratory networks and the recognized database, the text says, agree not to claim intellectual property on the PABS material and sequence information, but it does not talk about claiming, it does not address the issue about claiming IP over the use of the PABS material or over the modified materials. And when it comes to the other commercial and non-commercial users, there is a complete silence about intellectual property. So we are now creating a system where there is obligation to share material only for a lot of this to be appropriated or misappropriated through the intellectual property system, because we are allowing full claim of intellectual property monopoly. And this kind of proposals are actually being made by so-called champions of open access. So that's what we are seeing in these PABS negotiations. So there are also other provisions when it comes to contracts. So on intellectual property, we have done some research in this area. And when we look at pathogens that cause health emergencies, you will find that a large number of patent applications can be found over all sorts, over the sequence, the native sequence, the vaccine compositions, the use. And so it is very important for us to address it, the intellectual property issues, wherever the material and sequence information are shared with. So because as we all know, that this can potentially become a barrier to access. So it has to be addressed one way or another. Now, my final slide is on benefit sharing. So I showed you Article 12, Paragraph 5, legal certainty in terms of access and benefit sharing. But if we look at the text, and I just cut and paste some of the text proposed by the Bureau, not all of it on benefit sharing, but just some of it here on fake public health emergency of international concern, right? It talks about including options. And it says participating manufacturers shall implement benefit sharing provisions, including options. Now, when you have this kind of language, there is just no legal certainty because it's all very open-ended. It's vague. The participating manufacturers can do whatever they want because it just say including options, right? It doesn't even mean that they have to give presumably 1, 2, and 3, right? Because it's all optional. And we have had experience in the PIP that when it is optional, we are unlikely to see some of the benefits coming through. We don't see any set-asides for fake, which is a problem because fakes are more common than pandemics. There have been about 8 fakes, maybe even 9 since 2005. There is no certainty of licensing. We know during a health emergency that suddenly the demand increases. The question is, how do we rapidly increase supply? So there is not mentioned. It is put here as options. And we know when it's optional, the holders of intellectual property are unlikely to license it. There is also no certainty of monetary contributions. So if we say here, at all times, provide monetary benefits, including. Now, what does this mean? Is it being left to the discretion of the participating manufacturer? Are we just going to be seeing, nominal contributions, token contributions, rather than actual annual monetary contributions, right? So these are all challenges when we look at the provisions on benefit sharing. So I'll just end with this cartoon. Actually, this was posted and I found it, by Dawn, where we have a problem with what is being created right now because it is not driven by equity. It is not driven by public health. It's not driven by what we need during a fake or pandemic emergency. I think the aim has just become how many holes can be craftily created into the system so that everybody can avoid, obligations, requirements under the PABS system. And if this is the way it is heading, then, I think this is a challenge for what we are creating in the pandemic agreement. So with that, I end my presentation. I hope that was helpful and useful. And we will maybe head on to Nitin for his presentation. That was a discussion on contracts, and we are now moving to a presentation specifically on sequence information, which is a very hot topic in the PABS negotiations. How do we operationalize ABS for sequence information? So over to you, Nitin.
Thank you, Sankita, for interesting presentation, and hope the next presentation also would kind of get along to the discussion which we are doing and not necessarily out of the comprehension because of the technical arguments and words have been used in the context of using sequence information. Before moving into the discussion relating to the EU's position as well as the allies' position on the sequence information, I just wanted to have one slide about the status of ABS laws on the use of sequence information vis-a-vis genetic material. So first thing which we have to understand is benefit sharing is a right of provider countries and communities, not a rule for both genetic materials and information. Providers sometimes waive these rights, especially when they know they're not biodiversity-rich countries. For example, many countries in Europe, EU do not necessarily seek benefits from their genetic resources. Access to genetic materials and conditions for sharing of benefits, including from subsequent applications or secondary use, are determined by the countries and sometimes local communities and indigenous people. Conditions will be mutually agreed between the provider and the user. Now, this is how the conditions of genetic materials are. You share it for benefit share, and you decided what is the mutual terms and conditions. And the same is the case with the sequence information. Countries, communities can decide access to data, how it should happen, and conditions for benefit sharing or other terms of use of the sequence information. CBD's official position is this, and EU's position is also this. That's the most critical thing which I really want to send. I mean, what EU understands internally and been presenting across various fora is that this is feasible. But you should see what is happening in the negotiations with PABS. But before that, again, why am I saying all this? Just refer back to what is Article 15 of the CBD decision and EU position and decision 16.2, which happened 2024. Article 15.1 of the CBD states, recognizing sovereign rights of the states over their natural resources and authority to determine access to genetic resources. So when you talk about sovereign rights, it is a set of plural rights, right? It's not just one right. States have rights over their genetic resources. So if a genetic material is shared, the state have a right to decide what should happen with someone sequencing this particular genetic material, generating sequence data from that material, where should that data be deposited, in which type of database, under what conditions it to be subsequently used, and what sort of benefit sharing should come after the use of this database. States can decide that and is subject to national legislation. This is very clear. CBD Decision 16/2024 is also reiterating or recognizing this position very clearly. Now, if you look at EU Commission's guidance document from 2020, which is I've given in box, this is very, very clearly accepted by the EU Commission as well. In any case, the use and publication of such data, which is sequence data, which has been dealt under 2.3.5 or sequence information, might be covered by the conditions set in mutually agreed terms, which should be respected. In particular, those who access genetic resources and obtain sequence data from them should respect the conditions of the agreement entered into and inform subsequent actors about any rights and obligations attached to the data obtained and related to any further use of that data, right? So this is very, very clearly stated EU position in understanding of EU law as well, right? So the CBD Decision 2024, I'm saying, is further reaffirming this position as well. It's not something deviating from this position. Now, just referring back to CBD Deal 2022 and 2024, it's very clear that the national laws addressing use and benefit sharing from the use of sequence information through mutually agreed terms, including in international ABS instruments such as PABS, is possible, right? So it clearly reiterates the importance of this. When none of these laws and regimes cover, sequence information happens to available publicly, and users of such data could contribute a share of their revenue and profits with Kali Fund. This sharing is voluntary, and countries may develop incentivize such companies. This is basically a statement regarding the CBD's multilateral mechanism, which was established in Kali's Conference of Party in 2024. It's just a mechanism where when the companies or the users of sequences available, without being covered under any other ABS regime, they can voluntarily put some data. It's not actually dealing with, it's not actually creating a binding mechanism of providing access to sequence information or generating benefits from the use of sequence information. It's just creating an additional complementary mechanism called Kali Fund. Now, what companies are doing is essentially trying to create or seek complete exemption from benefit sharing if they are making this donation to the Kali Fund. And many of the proposals coming from the EU and the developed countries in the negotiations in PABS seems to be kind of following this requirement or the demand from the companies, right? So, but the CBD decision recognizes DSI data will be under different jurisdictions, and funds from Kali Fund has to be distributed to countries based on several factors, which includes contribution of publicly available DSI by the country. Now, when this is very clear that DSI will be subject to different jurisdiction and the funds will be distributed according to the contribution of the country, or one of the factors is of contribution of the country, it is clear that there is a need for databases to be accountable and transparent to countries and communities. Only then you would be clearly knowing from which country which data is coming, right? So that's a very, very important aspect, that the databases become accountable to all the parties, all the states, running an ABS regime. This is very important. Now, so what we have to also keep in mind, that ability to exercise these rights, right, which has been mentioned under the CBD context, which is the national sovereign rights, differ from parties to parties. So certain countries develop highly bureaucratic systems. Some developed countries create modalities to mediate contracts between providers and users. Some do not legislate. Now, when it comes to sequence data, countries are picking up capacities, such as to build a national database, set up a national, data access agreement, terms and conditions for the use of DSI, etc. While INSDC is a larger database collaboration, is basically frustrating the benefit sharing opportunities and possibilities via sharing sequence data anonymously. So this particular combination of databases from the EU, US, and Japan sharing sequence information keeps sharing data anonymously, so that you don't identify who the user is, and what sort of conditions can be applied on them. Now, INSDC is the biggest nucleotide sequence data collaboration, and academic systems, ecosystems across sometimes promote publishing and releasing data in INSDC. We could see some of these things in a later stage. So what happens in between is that certain funders of research projects also push transfer of samples and data to their institutions and countries, which are the developed countries, from developing countries without attaching conditions for secondary use. I mean, we could see this kind of concerns coming in African Academy of Sciences policy briefs, etc., that the funders request to transfer samples and data to their to the developed countries or the funders' host countries without attaching conditions for secondary use. So the ability to seek benefits from the subsequent use of samples and data has been critically compromised by the current ecosystem. And what we see today is that to change that ecosystem, to change that atmosphere, is being opposed by the developed countries and the global allies, I mean, the global North allies. So what are some of these positions in IGWIC? We could see one of the critical, interesting position from the European Union and allies is that benefit sharing from the use of information, sequence information cannot be binding. We are doubtful whether we can have binding obligation from the use of DSI, as the CBD multilateral mechanism, as I just mentioned, is voluntary. Now, I would argue that this is against the commitment under Article 12, which calls for a binding benefit sharing from the use of sequence information on an equal footing principle, right? So this is very important to understand. Even the CBD decision 16.2 is not just about the multilateral mechanism, but it is also explaining, or it's also recognizing by consensus that national laws and mutually agreed terms at the time of sharing genetic materials can set binding terms of use of sequence information, including benefit sharing obligation. Now, as I showed you previously, the EU's guidance document is also agreeing to this. Now, the CBD multilateral mechanism is distinct from the WHO's PABS system. Unlike the CBD mechanism, WHO PABS system seeks obligation to share sequence information from countries. Hence, benefit sharing also has to be binding on the part of the users of the sequence information. Only then equal footing principle agreed under Article 12 can be satisfied. Now we move on to the second argument, which says open access to sequence information means access without any condition. This is something which we regularly hear from the fora as a narrative said by many countries. But if you look at the EU submission to the CBD, in the meetings, prior to the decision 16.2, you could see that it clearly says the DSI, which is made publicly available in public databases, should be subject to same open access and general conditions for use as all other resources in the database. Okay, so this means conditions apply to open access data as well. EU make facilities for their nationals to share data through open access database, yet attach intellectual property conditions to those data. So EU's health data space regulation is also an example for this. So opposition from the EU against attaching conditions to open access data is only an opposition to implement ABS laws or to impose benefit sharing conditions on the use of sequence information, not about attaching conditions on the sequence. So it clearly shows the kind of double standard, I would say, which the developed countries are following, because their interest is not necessarily on the benefit sharing or the sovereign rights of the provider countries. Now, there is another important position coming from the EU and the global north is that WHO should not manage its own database. Let countries, data providers choose which database they want to share, but then databases should not be required to be registered or be in a contractual relationship with WHO. Now, the EU suggestion of letting countries choose database is consistent with international law, but not enough. EU seeks to opportunize its current dominance of databases and control over those databases, forcing countries to rely on foreign and external databases not accountable to them. This is what is currently happening, because if you look at the major popular databases, these are managed and dominated by agencies or institutions from the global north. So EU's opposition to WHO database is also inconsistent with their commitment to open access, because open access means anybody can actually start a database and run it, right? So as in a way to stop an institution from running a new database or managing an accountable database, to guarantee access to scientists and researchers seems to be kind of inconsistent, or not kind, seems to be, it is inconsistent with the commitment called for open access. Look at another important aspect coming from EU, which is the user registration and data access agreements, cannot be made a mandatory requirement such that users of data will be obligated to have terms of use for data, including benefit sharing. Now, this shows the ingenuity of the database of choice proposal, because EU institutions would continue control policies of databases, given and giving and then give a choice to countries to choose between devil and deep blue sea. I mean, to choose between couple of different models of databases which are not serving their interest. For example, you have one database which actually has user registration and data access agreement called GSAID, and or an entity runs database, which GSAID, but it is of private governance. It is not. It can unilaterally cut off access to researchers. It is not actually necessarily engaging to to enforce benefit sharing in the way countries want, right? So you could have this kind of database not listening to you, but a choice under the system. There is also another set of database which we were referring to, INSDC, where there is no user registration, no data access agreement. It can be just given as an anonymous user. So it's kind of telling this is not necessarily fitting along with the arguments. And then they make an argument that database governance, user registration, and data agreements compromise interoperability, free flow of data, as well as isolate PABS sequence information from other sequence information, which is a major bulk of data. Now, if you look at EU regulation on free flow of non-personal data, 2018 document, and EU regulation on health data spaces 2025, this position is contradictory, because they are actually calling for database governance, etc. And they're also talking about contractual agreements in the use of data. Meanwhile, talking about free flow of data and interoperability, etc. So this is a kind of an understanding which we have to keep in mind. Now we move on to another argument that the allies always make, that we cannot tell our researchers where to put PAP sequence data. Now, if you look at EU's stated position guidance document, it is very clear that a mutually agreed terms at the time of access to genetic material can address this particular issue of sequence information. Where should I, if I generate sequence information from a material received from the PAP system, should upload this particular data? Mutually agreed terms is a contractual agreement as defined under the EU guidance document. Now, if you look at University of Oslo's MIT, Swiss Academy of Science model of ABS agreement for non-commercial uses, etc., all regulate data generated, sometimes even sequence generated, and subsequent actions relating to the sequences from the materials. There is an argument that another position from the EU, that traceability is not feasible, monitoring of use of data is not possible. Now, Article 12 already calls for traceability measures, so you cannot go back from this commitment. So EU's regulations also provide, like the two other regulations I mentioned above, provide measures like data audits, keeping of logs, provision of information for competent authorities, and monitoring and compliance of data users. This is clearly available in these databases. We would see some of these elements in the next coming slides. So I'm not going much details, but showing some of the documents to demonstrate that these are already being accepted and already being put into use by EU under various documents. So the question is whether the database governance, including registration contracts with WHO or user registration and data access agreements, compromise free flow of data and interoperability. As I said, if you look at some of the regulations, it's very clear it is not. And you could also see Germany's sponsorship and defense of GSAID across various World Health Assemblies. And this would also show you that this is feasible. Traceability is feasible. Enforcing benefit sharing is feasible. These are all accepted positions from an EU country called Germany, right? It's not that we are appreciating GSAID's model of database, and while we appreciate its model, the fact that this particular database is governed by a private entity and is not accountable to WHO member states multilaterally makes this particular database unsuitable for the PAP system. But the model where the GSAID uses user registration, identity verification, and data access agreement could be very well utilized by the WHO recognized databases in order to promote a responsible use of data along with open access. So I'm just showing some documents. I'm just skipping through. I'm not reading it out. This is the EU regulation 2018 on the free flow of non-personal data in the European Union. If you look at Article 5, you could see there are commitment to provide data to competent authorities, to perform their lawful duties. So if WHO wants to ensure that the PABS sequence information use leads to benefit sharing, it's a competent authority and data could be provided to it. Of course, this particular law only applies to EU, but I'm just trying to say that this could also be applied externally outside to EU as well. And here, you could even see there are provisions for visiting database or data processing equipments and inspecting them by visiting the natural premises or the premises of the natural or the legal persons utilizing this particular data. So it's very much feasible to have data audits under the EU's framework of free flow of data. It is not cutting down free flow of data. It's very, very clear from the EU law. If you move to the health data space regulation 2025, you could see enormous, it's a 90-page document of regulation, how health data, including pathogen genomic data, needs to be shared, right? It has several regulatory structures. There is no time to explain all of them, but you could see that how this particular data has to be shared, etc. So health data access bodies will determine the health data access applications and health data request from the users, and then issue data permits. Health data holders, including those who manage databases, has to provide access to data based on the data permits. If you look at the contents of data access application and data permits, you would see how in-depth it is with regard to user identification, purpose of the use of data, duration of the use of data, and handling of data, onward transfer of data, all these things you could very, very clearly see. And there is also a provision which calls for trusted open public databases to share non-personal electronic health data, but to have a robust, transparent, sustainable governance, including a transparent model of user access. So it's a very, very clear law under the European health space data. Again, you could see cross-border infrastructure to be built where other third countries and international organizations may become authorized participants of the European Union infrastructure when they comply with the regulations of the data, of the EU laws, right? So this is a very interesting thing. They want the entire international system to be or the international infrastructure to work in a way to be complying with the EU law, and perhaps do not care about national ABS laws of other countries existing outside, right? So this is a situation where we are in. So there are cross-border registries and databases which has to be also registered with relevant health data access bodies. So these are very interesting provisions under European health data space. I'm not showing this, but I'm not explaining the next slide, but it is a screenshot from data access application of health from this particular regulation. You could see health data applicants' identity and identity of natural persons who would be processing all this data, etc., etc. You could see description of safeguards to prevent misuse of the electronic health data has also to be provided, etc. You could see all. So what I'm trying to say is that this kind of a detailed law and understanding regarding terms of use of data exist in Europe, and they did not want to see some of these things to be applied at international level or at the WHO level. You could see data permits and etc., how cross-border data transfer happens. I'm showing here. And this is a very, very important provision, Article 89, which talks about international governmental access to non-personal electronic health data, where specifically calls for that digital health authorities, data access bodies, etc., in that infrastructure which you use mentioning, to take measures, including contractual agreements, in order to prevent the transfer of such data to a third country or an international organization, where such transfer would create a conflict with the union law or the national law of the relevant member states. So the only problem here is this union law or the national law of the member state is not necessarily applied to other member states, right? So the kind of privilege which they secure for the European Union, it's inside, is not extended to developing countries or other countries who might lack capacities to manage some of this particular infrastructure which we will see. I'm
Nitin,
showing.
you have
Yes.
to move a bit fast, 2-3 minutes, if you can wrap up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So if you could see Germany's EB statement on 2017, it could show that the GSAID, the database which we were talking about, allows traceability of GST, right? It's very clearly saying this. And you could see that Germany is saying this particular database is publicly accessible. It is free and open to anyone who positively identifies himself, agrees to respect the rights of the contributors, etc. It's also saying GSD in the GSAID is permitting lawful audits and providing basis for an enforceability mechanism. So it's a very clear practical thing that a database can bring in enforceability mechanism for benefit sharing and provide lawful audits of the use and the log of data. It's another statement from World Health Assembly 70. Germany is saying that GSAID actually supports rapid sharing of data. Against the argument which you would see that database regulation, user registration, etc., delays data sharing within the IGWIG. It says acknowledgement of data providers, active collaboration, etc., is promoted. Full traceability of GST is promoted. Sharing of benefits is promoted by GSAID. So this is also very clear, right? If you look at another interesting aspect from the Germany statement relating to GSAID and GenBank, GSAID were responding to an argument that the data given to GSAID, which is a user registration protected open access database, should be shared with to INSDC also, which is not protected database, on a secure database after a stated period or 6 months. And the GSAID is telling, Germany is telling, they do not see a meaning in this. They are seeing it as unnecessary because GSAID is already publicly accessible and it has all systems to do whatever it has to do with the research and things. So whereas if you look at certain EU lobbies and networks, they would say interoperability means sharing data in more and more databases or several other databases. So this is a very interesting concern, which I can show you. I'm just skipping through other things. You could see how GSAID has been supported in terms of its unprecedented speed of sharing data and centralizing data by both international CEPI as well as IFPMA. You could see the proposals from African Academy of Sciences talking about distributed ledger technologies, smart contracts, material transfer agreements, showing that scientists are not afraid of data access agreement or material transfer agreement, as we regularly hear from European Union and allies in the WHO negotiations. You could see Public Health Alliance for Genomic Epidemiology also calling for very, very clear conditions on the use of secondary use of data submitted to databases. So it's a very, very clear thing that scientists do not fear material transfer agreements or data access agreements. University of Oslo calls for MTA for non-commercial research and says that this MTA could deal with data generated from this material. It's a very, very clear thing. It clearly shows that the recipient must submit sequence data to the INSDC databases. It's a call by University of Oslo, right? To say that this should be given to the INSDC database. So if that could be mentioned in this particular material transfer agreement, why is it that WHO PABS material transfer agreement or PABS contract cannot say that the recipients of PABS materials, when they generate sequences, should only submit the data into a particular protected open access database, which would guarantee access to researchers as well as ensure fair and equitable benefit sharing, right? Why should we should believe the argument that Global North makes that they cannot ask their researchers to where to put data they generate from the genetic materials. Swiss Academy of Sciences again talks about a lot of things, starting from non-commercial use, non-commercial research, data sharing, and intellectual property rights relating to data sharing. I'm not showing what it is, but you could see these kind of documents already exist. There is an argument coming from Europe that says PABS data will be isolated if you create a PABS-specific database, etc., but it's not looking at the larger database ecosystem, which is already in a very fragmented way, yet working in an interoperable manner, right? So statement of isolation is therefore an excuse to oppose accountable database, which will create attached benefit sharing obligation as conditions to use of sequence information. If you look at biomedical data, human genomic data, for example, European Genome Phenome Archive uses user registration, right? So there are already a lot of biomedical data behind user registration, and all this data is required. And there has been no argument that this kind of biomedical databases are creating isolated data silos in the research ecosystem. So why is it user registration and data access agreement important? Because it shifts the current understanding of use of data on the basis of IP address to an identity-based authentication. It helps establishment of uptake of obligations, and also establish locus of responsibility on the recipients of data. It creates enforceable benefit sharing obligations, as Germany was suggesting. It will also improve transparency and appropriate access to DSI, which is required to achieve a specialized instrument status for the PABS system. It will also, I would say, bind users from all parts of the world, including from non-parties of pandemic agreement. I mean, we could see some of the policy briefs coming from European Scientific Network worries that users of non-state parties to pandemic agreement access data from global databases and put it into their private databases and work in a separate manner. So if you have a data access agreement, you could probably contractually bind them under private international law and move forward, right? There is also a biosecurity angle where WHO's guidance and laboratory guidance very, very clearly call for that development of DNA databases, etc., is risky at this stage. I mean, has created increased risk, and in order to address this increased risk, material transfer agreement should actually start dealing with publication of information about generated from high consequence materials so that there can be better biosafety and biosecurity measures. Academics also made some publications which calls for multi-factor user authentication, login registration, which is available in almost all databases, including sometimes in some of the Netflix kind of database, I mean, video streaming platforms, right, provides better safeguards. And why do we need last slide? Why do we need a WHO managed PAP specific sequence database? Because to guarantee non-discriminatory access to all researchers, to all users willing to be a PAPS participant is then given, right? Only then the requirement of open access can be met. If you don't have a database which would serve the PAPS purposes, then you will not be guaranteeing access to all users to the PAPS sequence data. Any of these databases, both INSDC as well as GSAID, can cut access to researchers from different parts of the world. And better data aggregation, IFPMA was saying GSAID is centralizing data, which was very useful for their research during COVID-19 pandemic, right? And better facilities for knowledge exchange and research collaboration, right? They could actually provide links and facilities to publish research results on these data and link it with original data and original material, etc. Now, better chances. So once WHO have a maintained database, there is a better chances that the other databases also do not feel that now the WHO is dependent on them. So making them come to WHO for recognition, right? So they would also undertake the standards established by WHO, which could actually promote interoperability, which is very, very clean. We could take up an argument on interoperability in another point of time. Then there is multilateral governance, which ensures clear provenance, scientific provenance, which is very, very important to improve the faith in the VTDs which are developed to respond to pandemics. And finally, I would argue that the multilateral governance of databases ensure that obligations of companies also do not duplicate and overlap. If you look at the EU submission to CBD in 2023, it's very clear. When you have a separate system and the separate system discusses about use of DSI and benefit sharing from the use of DSI of that, like the PAP system, which talks about pathogens of pandemic potential, then, and you clearly are able to identify that data in a database, then, there is no overlap between other mechanisms, right? So the role of databases in ensuring the sequences are identified according to jurisdiction is a very, very important aspect. And a WHO coordinated or a recognized network of databases would help us to get this. Thank you for patient listening. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Nitin. That had a lot of information. Quite a long presentation. I hope you found it useful. I did let Nitin go on a bit, but I think it had useful information for all of us to listen to. I think at the heart of it is, we are sharing sequence information. Countries that are sharing should deserve accountability and transparency. And we do see a model where you can have user registration, you can have data access agreement. We already know EU states are already endorsing this model. So we don't understand why, when it comes to PAPS, the standards change, right? Why can't we have such a similar system? Why suddenly, a model that is endorsed by IFPMA, SEPI, suddenly when it comes to PAPS, they say, oh, this is too difficult. There's a lot of different problems. And we live in a day and age where we do login, we do user registration almost on a daily basis. We agree to so many different terms and conditions on a daily basis online. So we don't understand why this is so different when it comes to sequence information. But if you have anybody has questions, please put in the chat. As you can see, we are running late. But I would like to hand over to the discussants. If you have any questions, you can put in the chat. I will see if I can take some of these questions. So we have three discussants. Let me just introduce. I have Moga. As I mentioned, the discussants have extensive experience in public health, in the negotiations as well. We have Moga, Policy Advisor for People's Medicines Alliance, Lauren, Associate Professor of the University of Cape Town, and Jaume Vidal, Consultant for Health Action International. So there are some questions in the chat, which I think you may have seen. There is a question about, how do we influence the EU position? The challenge seems to be the Commission. Is it better that we speak to the European Union countries because the position of the Commission? There is a question on the current political moment in the negotiations, maybe that you may wish to answer, you may not wish to answer. Maybe Nitin could answer that. So over to you. You have 5 minutes. If you can stick to the time, that would be really great. Thank you. Maybe over to Moga first. Moga, we don't hear you, Moga.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so answering Piotr's question about the EU, I've got 3 points to make there quickly. One, basically, the main point really is to go personal, like to go what is useful or unuseful for Europe. And that's where the question of biosafety is important, because I really don't understand. They think that the data will go to their wonderful labs and everybody's nice and sweet there, and then they give it to companies and everybody's nice and sweet, and they will make the products for the Europeans nice, everything is fine. This data, we have AI, we have things flying all over the world in no time. And unless you have a trusted system of following where, like contracts to show where the data is going from the provider, the countries that provides it, to who is the first receiver, to who is the second receiver, to who is the third receiver, so that you can follow as much as possible. I'm sure there will be some leaks, but as much as possible, you do that. And the trusted international agency to that is WHO. And that would minimize the safety dangers. And that's one thing we really need to highlight that. I mean, I talked about safety like in the INB long time ago, and Europe didn't notice that at all. They never commented on that, or any other country for that matter. So it seems they're not, I don't know, they're not aware of that danger. And it's not like China, the naughty. No, it's people in Europe, can leak this information. So that's one thing about the safety. The other thing about if we don't accept at least some of the demand that the South is making, we've got the US MOUs, and therefore, you're actually endangering that the material and the sequence is going to the US. The US labs, US companies, and you will have to wait, just like we in Africa have waited for vaccines. So it's in your benefit as Europe. So I will talk to the Commission on their own benefit. The second thing is to go to some of the, as you suggested, Piotr, some of the good countries, and we have experience with that on ACTA. I don't know if you remember this counterfeit kind of agreement that they wanted to pass. Actually, it passed in America, but it didn't pass in Europe. And partly for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that a huge number of civil society worked on specific countries. I mean, I remember working with the UK, and UK was we were part of Europe, and it was good. We had a good government or good people anyway, and therefore it failed. But also, what I learned from this experience was we worked with non-traditional allies, like we worked with the software and the music industries, the little ones, not the big Netflix type. So I think what we need maybe to work with some of the labs, some of the I don't know the non-country, non-pharma, non-civil society, these other people who have interest in this issue, and try to get them. If the labs say, no, we want to have these contracts, that might pressurize the commission. But the thing is, we have to work fast on that one. So yeah, I was going to talk about benefit sharing, but I think we had enough about benefit sharing. Just two things to highlight is I remember the quote from van der Leyen in 2020 saying that, she was talking about solidarity within the EU. So we didn't have vaccines at the time, 2020. The same applies to access to vaccines in low middle income countries. Like this, they're committed to that, just like they're committed to vaccines within Europe. Once we had the vaccine, that all disappeared. They put money in COVAX and they thought that's it, we're done our bit, which is obviously not the thing. Yeah, and it's really important that we understand that we don't have to wait for the benefit sharing or even for the contracts when we have a pandemic. That's too late, basically. We've lived through mpox. Before that, we lived through HIV, for God's sake. People were dying in millions in the south, and the medicine was there in the north. We lived through COVID. People were dying in Africa, and we were getting the vaccine in Europe for non-at-risk people, and health workers in Africa. How many of this should we have lived through to understand that it is very dangerous to wait for that. My last point is that the time, and I'm really worried about that because everybody, north and south and everywhere, want to have this multilateral agreement signed. That's great. But to push the South that, well, we're not going to accept this. So you kind of have to accept that we're not going to accept whatever you guys want in the South. And therefore, but you have signed the agreement. No, that is just not fair. And that's like, we passed that time. Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
But thanks, Nathan and Sangeeta. It's brilliant. And your work is brilliant. And Sangeeta, I remember you arguing during the influenza agreement. Which year was that? Years and years ago. Similar arguments.
Some time ago. The issues seem to be the same. Okay, there is a question from Nicholas from Germany that this is not a critical discussion, but to bash EU positions, to state that the data needs to flow, interact with other databases for health security reasons. Haven't heard any reply and answer. They are saying that we have built PABS SII for public health reasons. If we stick with CBD, we can also leave it in CBD. INSD is funded by some and open for the whole world. GSAID also just works by downloading data there. GSAID does not have any binding benefit sharing access agreements. Finally, the data space interpretation is misleading. So maybe Nitin, you can perhaps respond this. I just want to mention that this is not about bashing the EU position, but I think we are trying to expose, and that is why we have in our slides highlighted the various material transfer agreements, the terms and conditions that we find in the material transfer agreements. We have highlighted the conversations that have taken place around GSAID, and that is why we have put all of this in the slide. So please be assured this is not about EU bashing. We are very open to having a very frank discussion, and that is what we have put in our slides. The question, I think, for EU is whether you recognize that you are doing this, and rather than exporting systems that we know don't work, we would like to export models that work. For instance, like Germany has, the GSET model with user registration and DAA. Let's see how we can operationalize it within the PABS system. So I think this is what we are communicating, that these models are being endorsed, they are working. So why are we denying its application in the PABS system? But I'll let Nitin and whoever, any of the other panelists that want to respond to this.
Let Jomi and Lauren present,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
of course. So can I invite Lauren? Lauren, would you like to take the floor first? Thank you.
Thanks, Sangeeta, and good day to everyone. And maybe just to echo what you said, Sangeeta, about global best practices, I think really the focus is very much on um, exemplary regulations and how to standardize those or to globalize them. So to have a best case scenario in terms of, for example, biosecurity, and I think that's really where the focus is, as I understand it in what both of you have presented, and also to show that it's doable. It is being done, it has been done, it has proven successful. I think we saw that with the PIP framework and the surveillance capacity that had been invested in labs and how useful that proved during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So that's just in response to the latter comment. On the question of alliances and who to work with, I think, on this issue that scientists will find it too complex to engage in mechanisms that ensure accountability and transparency. I think that's not really a believable position for me. I say that as someone who works in a university setting. And I say that also because I think if we look at the knowledge production space, there's been a lot of effort over the last couple of years to create relationships, research partnerships that are not only more equitable, so, between partners that have equal sort of resources and responsibilities when they do international collaborations, but are in fact transformative and alter existing power relations to lead with Southern epistemologies, Southern research agendas. And so I think what we see is that the scientific community in Europe is actually championing this. And so they themselves would be willing to sign up, I think, for accountability and transparency mechanisms. So just one concrete example is the Africa Charter. It's being championed by my university, University of Cape Town, University of South Africa, and Bristol University. And that charter focuses on transformative research partnerships that actually invert existing power relations between North and South. And it's been endorsed by several institutions in the EU. So this includes the Berlin University Alliance and the Coimbra Group, which is an alliance of universities in Europe, and globally also, for example, by the Australia Africa University Network and the Commonwealth Association, the Association of Commonwealth Universities. So I think what a growing number of European scientists are saying is that it's important to change the knowledge production ecosystem, and certainly what's being proposed by the Africa Group and the Group of Equity is one component of that. I think also in terms of kind of having the EU position align with its interests in other places or other spaces, it's important to think about, for example, the Global Gateway Initiative. So at the 7th European Union African Union Summit last year, President von der Leyen said we want Africa and Europe to be partners of choice. Okay. I think that's difficult if you don't. So some of the principles informing the Global Gateway Initiative are equal partnerships, good governance, transparency, being security focused. All of those, if they apply in Global Gateway, I think they can also apply in the PABS negotiations. And certainly they have to apply if we're not going to end up with an orientation towards pathogen access that is extractivist. And then maybe just a final point on contracts. A South African colleague, Fatima Hassan, and two colleagues last year published a paper on contracts that the South African government negotiated with pharmaceutical companies. And it makes the point that when you're negotiating under duress, the contracts inevitably end up being really bad for the weaker party. So they call this policy making via contract, because not only did the contracts have poor terms in terms of predictability of supply of vaccines or high prices, but also the contract sometimes helped institutionalize new and highly problematic principles, right? So, for example, vaccine indemnification. And so what we don't want is negotiating contracts again during emergencies. What we want is that there are contracts that are on the books, that are clear, that specify obligations, and that don't have to be concluded under duress, because that is more likely to guarantee equity. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So the contracts, the contracts, if done properly, they can actually improve equity. But you're right, it's a game of power often, right? If you're under at the point of pandemic, you are between a company that has significant power and a country that is in need, right? So the power imbalance will lead to such a contract that is leads to inequity. And I think we saw this a lot during COVID-19. So over to Jauma. Jauma, if you can share your thoughts. I think there are some other questions. I just read them from Vanita. The pandemic agreement is going on and on. The key to negotiations is PABS. Will the 80 countries of Africa, they are not all of Africa, but Africa and Group for Equity and a few other countries stay strong to resist the EU? What is your sense? Well, it's to TWN as your observers in the process. What will break the deadlock in a weakening multilateral system overall? Another question is by Vanita, how do you implement principles and values like non-discrimination and equity within a treaty like the pandemic agreement? How do you enforce this without legal backing? So I just hand over to Jauma. We are running a bit late, behind time. Maybe we can have just prolong the conversation a bit more. Over to you, Jauma.
I'm going to speak super fast. Thank you, Sangeeta, and thank you, the speakers. I think that we are in a point of the discussion where we are really seeing that there are some topics that are complex, as this negotiation is complex in the sense that we are looking at the EU, because the EU is like a critical participant in this negotiation. I mean, they are very much at the table and they are very much contributing. The problem, and I think that this has been already noted several times, is the contradiction both between like past stances of the European Commission or other European Union institutions and what they are saying now, and what the institutions are currently doing. I think that Lauren was right, like signaling like the global gateway, and the global gateway that is supposed to be really a support for like African ownership in terms of, for instance, pharmaceutical manufacturing. And we see the EU supporting tech transfer schemes. And then we see that in the pandemic accord discussions, it's really, and I think I really value the opinion, the comment by, I'm looking it now, by Nicholas, in the sense that it's true that sometimes it's like too easy to criticize and go, yeah, the EU is doing everything wrong. But in a sense, there are like several points that needs to be raised regarding the EU. And I think that one that it's really important is that the incoherence between their own policies, especially regarding open access or really all the public funded research that should be really accessible to the public, and that this is not translated into the negotiations. And then I think that both Sangeeta and Nitin were really good at going to the detail, the granular aspect of some of the text that is being negotiated. And I think that there are some passages that are especially important in the sense, what message does it send to the international community when you reject WHO as the leading partner, as the host of the database? What are you saying there? In the sense, you see, there are many ways of really weakening an organization. One is leaving the organization, leaving the room and deserting the table. The other saying, no, we can do something else. It's like, let's not work on silos. and then we build another silo. And I think on that basis, I think it's really interesting that we see G8 and we see INSDC. And the issue here, I think that it can be useful to make the parallel with the platforms, like the economy of platforms of like Meta, Apple, Amazon. The EU is really skeptic about this model, and it says that these US-based businesses can affect European sovereignty. But then when it comes to databases, I know that's different. It's really important to see that there is like a sovereignty element in there. And I want to finish with something that I believe it's important that we see first, like that these negotiations, it's like, the negotiation is a success when everybody is equally unhappy. That, yeah, we have to get a compromise. But the issue here, it was very clear within like slides that we are really consolidating loopholes, that we are really making it possible for the treaty not to be fully implemented in the future. And the problem is like these loopholes overlap with fundamental rights. So in a sense, we are like building shortcuts to fundamental rights. And the issue in terms of legitimacy for an international treaty that is deemed to respond to pandemics, it's very much concerning. And I think it's really like this thing, like we've seen developing countries like compromising since the beginning. In the sense, you see, like, no intellectual property mentions, it's too divisive. Technology transfer, but only voluntary. No, you know what? Voluntary and in mutually agreed terms. You see? Yeah. And it's really like 1 inch and then another and then another. And now we have this narrative that we are in how they say it, like a chokehold. I mean, the negotiations are going to fail. So you have to accept. You have to accept now, 2 in the morning. If not, there will be no pandemic treaty and you will be to blame. And that's something, the problem is like the first time that they do this, you say, okay, yeah, it's dramatic. The second time that they do this, and it happens in WTO, it happens in WHO, and I think that it's important that really that we are able to back the position of these 80 plus countries that say, we have this proposal on the table. What do you say? And we have the EU, we have Japan, we have Australia, like maybe 30 countries maximum. Because at the end of the day, if we want to talk about global governance, this is the dialogue and this is like the reported forces. But I think that we have to be aware that there are like members of the European Union that abstained when the pandemic accord was voted in the World Health Assembly. I think that there is like trouble at home. There are some countries that, well, may have problems then ratifying and like switching tracks completely on the singular positions. I think that Spain. I think Spain is a country that has a lot to say behind closed doors. I think that they are really pushing, that they are really trying, that they have to, like the European Union, once they talks on behalf of all of them. But I think Spain, it's like a country that is listening to civil society, talking with Por Derecho, talking with others. I think that Ireland is a country that it's also willing to listen. Belgium. There are countries that are not comfortable with how the Commission is managing this negotiation. And then there are other countries that are really very vocal in their positions. It's like Germany, it's like Norway. And these are positions that, well, they are not, I don't think that they are in line with what the European Union values stand, because just like for my closing remarks, you see, like it is very often said, you see, it was the European Union through the European Union Council that first proposed the idea of a pandemic treaty. Yeah, but they proposed that to counter the proposal for a TRIPS waiver that South Africa and India had put forward. And they said, "Oh, don't worry about the waiver. Don't worry about that. We will have a pandemic treaty and we will deal with about this there." And we got what we got at the WTO level, and now we are in the pandemic accord, and we are like 5 minutes to midnight, and they are saying, "You see, there's nothing else we can do." But I think that we can, and there is, and we need to keep on pushing. And I would like to make a comment about like the role of like Third World Network, because the issue is really one thing. It's to be in the room with the players. Other is to be in the room with the players and then tell the others what's going on and educate the conversation and really empower the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jama. You made really, I think, very interesting and really great points. I don't want to repeat them, but I think, at the end of the day, this is not, we are creating a system. It's not about EU or the South. We are creating a system for public health. But if you have a system that is not about fairness, equity, it is unbalanced, it is extractive, it cannot work for public health. And I always remember when COVID broke out, I think it was April, we are now in 2026, but April 2020, if I'm not mistaken, yes. The Commission, von der Leyen said, the Chancellor of Germany as well said, right, we are in it together, international solidarity, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we never really saw that, we saw huge inequity. So this is a moment for us, where the world is even more split than ever before, for us to actually come together and to create something that works for everyone, but, just making putting off proposals that we know that, like provisions that we commonly see, we see it in the PIP framework, we see it in material transfer agreements, we see models that are there, but then just to kind of say, we cannot follow all of this in this current negotiations because, all of this hinders innovation. But that is not true, right? Because we have seen it work before. Another common argument is that, we cannot sign contracts before we access materials and sequences. Why? I mean, contracts. Before you access anything, you need to sign contracts. I cannot imagine European labs saying, oh, you can have material, but, you can sign contracts later, right? So, I mean, these are all basic issues, and we are the tension, the disagreement over issues that we shouldn't be disagreeing on, and we should be really aiming far beyond for a system that works, that can deliver during a health emergency, a pandemic, because such a system will work for everyone, and that such a system keeps everyone safe as well. Okay, we have come to the end. I think we do need to have more discussions. If I can give to Nitin and Lauren, you wanted to take the floor again, but very quickly. Yeah, even Nitin, very quickly, because, we are way past our time. But I think we have had a lot of good feedback, input. If I can hand to Nitin, then to Lauren.
Thank you. I will try to be fast. But
Please.
the questions are a lot. But to begin with the first question, that the data needs to flow and interact among databases for health security, very health security reasons. Haven't heard any reply and answer to that. I don't know whether there was a previous question relating to it, but just to say that having user registration and data access agreement in one database will not allow that the data from that database to interact with data from other databases is absolutely wrong. It's a misunderstanding, because if you look at, there are several databases in the scientific world providing research data in different formats, right? And different facilities and modalities apply to each of these databases. And researchers do collaborate, do collect data from all of these databases and work. They sometimes integrate data into cloud databases, in their own personal cloud databases. Sometimes they download into laptops and work, etc. So there is no question of having user registration or data access agreement cutting down the interaction between data stored in different databases. That's the first thing I had to remind. Second, there is a discussion regarding INSDC and GSAID, and INSDC being a very, very funded by Global North for supporting the whole world. But you must understand INSDC has been engaging after, it is an establishment before CBD. But after Convention on Biological Diversity, INSDC has never respected the rights of the states providing genetic materials from which the data has been generated. So the 20 years or 2 decades of disrespect to those rights is a very important question, right? To disrespect to national ABS laws is a very important question, right? This has to be addressed. And
Nitin, we don't hear you, Nitin. You may have muted yourself.
hello, am I audible? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
now
But
yes.
you need to wrap up, Nitin, here.
Sorry. Yeah. So I was saying the INSDC has been disrespectful of or frustrating ABS laws across the world for the last several decades after CBD, right? Or 1 decade after the Nagoya Protocol, right? And then the GSAID. GSAID is also kind of supporting several things in terms of user registration and kind of protecting the rights of the contributor scientists or originating laboratories, but not the general benefit sharing laws of required for public health or global public health as such, right? So it is not supporting an expanded benefit sharing regime. It's only supporting a very, very narrow understanding of benefits or narrow understanding of the rights of the provider scientist, not the rights of the country or the community. So this is a big issue. Second, GSAID is managed by a private entity, right? Both GSAID and INSDC is not multilaterally governed. So that other countries who is participating in the PAP system do not have an ability to influence the policies of these databases. And according to the policies of these databases, this could change their provision of providing access. NIH can cut access to INSDCs to researchers from China, researchers from South Africa, because you interfered in some issue related to Ukraine or South or Gaza or whatever it is, right? So this can happen. And then the problem of so this is an issue which I wanted to highlight. So if we want to guarantee access to researchers without discrimination, you need to have at least one database which is accountable multilaterally to all member states. This is very, very important. And I think there is one more last question. Maybe I don't have to respond to it. Yes, sorry, it has to be responded because it is something about European health data space and saying that the interpretation is misleading. Actually, I have put my slide and the slide is very clearly talking about the unrestricted use or access mentioned there. I think unrestricted use, if I just go back and see the slide. Give me a minute. It includes Article 60, unrestricted, yes, ensure unrestricted access for all users. So it has to ensure unrestricted access for all users and data storage and preservation, and through trusted open public databases. And these through trusted open public databases should have transparent governance, transparent model of user access. So who is accessing the data has to be clearly transparent. That's first aspect. Second, the trusted data holders, right? They have, who are trusted data holders? If you look back the regulation, the trusted data holders have to have necessary guarantees to ensure compliance with EU regulations, right? They should have the ability to monitor and ensure the compliance by the data access users. So for the EU regulation, has to be the databases has to focus, or the trusted data holders have to focus on enforcing those regulations. So the question is, why is it that databases should not apply the same logic to ensure compliance with ABS laws of WHO or the rest of the parties, right? So it is a clear double standard, which was the argument. Thank you.
Thanks. Lauren, you'll have to be really short.
Very short, and I really want to re-emphasize what you said, Sangeeta, about this being for everyone, and it has public health implications. And I think if anyone doubts that, they need to look at what happened with global North countries trying to negotiate with pharmaceutical corporations during COVID. I think the North is negotiating from a position where they assume the corporations can be disciplined. This was not the case during COVID, despite massive amounts of public funding. And so it really is important to get the contracts clear, agreed to upfront. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone on this panel. I think we had really exciting discussion. I'm sorry we didn't take like questions and like raising questions from the floor, although you did put it in the chat, but you're not able to speak. But I think this is a very contentious, a very a discussion that we opened up. It will take another 1 hour, and we will probably not finish. But we wanted to share that information, and I just want to mention, I think we are not. It's not about EU bashing. I think we want to put out facts. And that is why we populated all the slides with as much facts as we could put, to say that we need to have an honest and fair discussion on what actually is happening in Europe, elsewhere, and what we need to deliver the objective of the pandemic agreement. So I'm sure we'll have more of these conversations. But for now, thank you very much. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists for your interventions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Thank you, TWN.
WN.